December 1943. The Atlantic roared like a wounded beast, its winter waves rising and crashing in long, thunderous rolls against the hull of the Liberty ship. Steel groaned, rigging rattled, spray slashed across the deck in cold, relentless sheets. And beneath all that noise, beneath the storming wind, beneath the grinding engines, lay the muffled breathing of 2,000 German prisoners packed into the dark belly of the ship. In that cramped cavern, shadows trembled with every pitch of the vessel. Men clung to wooden bunks slick with saltwater residue, their fingers white, their thoughts darker than the ocean outside. Somewhere above, boots stomped, chains clanked, voices barked in unfamiliar English. The ship lurched, creaked, and powered westward, ever westward, toward a country they had been taught to fear more than death itself. They whispered the same questions that had haunted them since Tunisia. What will the Americans do to us? Will they starve us? Will they shoot us? Why are we still alive? No one answered. No one could. Official Nazi briefings had shown a different America. An America in ruins, collapsing under racial chaos, ruled by criminals, infested with decadence, incapable of discipline. A mongrel nation, they had called it. A land where factories stood silent, fields lay barren, and soldiers cowered behind machines because they lacked the strength to fight like real men. But the truth of the Atlantic contradicted all of that. Because this ship, this towering floating fortress forged in steel and thunder, was American, and it sliced through the waves with brutal mechanical purpose. Every bolt and beam seemed to hum with a confidence the prisoners had never imagined. A confidence that made men shift nervously in the gloom, whispering half-remembered prayers. The 11th night was the worst. The sea turned violent, slamming the ship sideways with hammering gusts. The vessel listed sharply, left, then right, bunks tilting, bodies rolling, voices rising in panicked German. Someone shouted that this was it, that Americans were sinking them on purpose. Another screamed that the ocean was swallowing them whole, but the ship did not break. It growled, steadied, and pressed forward. Just before dawn on the 12th day, the storm eased. Light, thin, gray, ghost-like, filtered through the slats above. The engines slowed. The voices of American sailors shifted in tone. They were preparing for something. Then the order came, echoing down the metal corridor. "On deck! Everyone on deck! Move!" The prisoners crawled, stumbled, and climbed their way up the ladder shafts. Boots clanged on steel steps. Cold air rushed down, sharp as knives, cutting through unwashed uniforms. One by one, blinking like men waking from nightmares, they emerged into the open, and froze. Fog hung low, swirling in silver ribbons, drifting like spirits across the water. For a heartbeat, everything was quiet. Eerily, impossibly quiet. Then, slowly, through the mist, a silhouette emerged. Tall, immense, unmistakable, a crane, then another, then 20. As the fog rolled back, the world revealed itself in staggering, impossible scale. Norfolk Naval Base, a titan of steel and industry rising out of the water like some colossal machine. Towering gantries arched overhead. Cargo ships squatted along piers that stretched endlessly into the distance. Giant warehouses rose like man-made cliffs, their windows gleaming. Locomotives rattled along the rails, hauling freight cars stacked with crates, barrels, engines, supplies, and people, so many people. Black dock workers in overalls, white sailors in crisp uniforms, civilians in heavy coats. They moved with purpose and rhythm, talking, laughing, working with an ease that made the German prisoners' chests tighten. The air smelled of coal smoke and warm bread. Warm bread. One prisoner, barely 20, eyes hollow from North African hunger, stared at a group of American laborers eating sandwiches stacked with thick slices of meat. Meat. He gripped the railing as if the ship were tilting again. A whisper broke out among them, trembling, cracking. "This can't be America. America was supposed to be starving." Another voice answered, low and afraid. Then, what have they told us back home? For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply stood there, shivering in the cold Atlantic wind, staring at a nation that was supposed to be on its knees, yet instead towered before them in strength they could feel in their bones. Somewhere deep inside each man, something ruptured. Not the ship, not the world, but a belief. A belief hammered into them for years. A belief that their nation was the pinnacle of discipline and power, and that America was a decadent giant made of paper. Yet here, in the dawn light, stood a country so vast, so organized, so abundantly alive that it made their chests tighten and their mouths go dry. A country unfazed by war. A country still building, still booming, still laughing. A country that looked nothing like the propaganda posters. The Liberty ship groaned as it docked, lines thrown, engines slowing. But the Germans barely noticed. Their eyes remained fixed on the horizon, on the endless cranes, the sprawling warehouses, the trains rumbling with goods, the workers who looked fed, strong, and unafraid. For the first time since capture, a new fear dawned on them. Not fear of hunger, not fear of torture, but fear of the truth. They had not just lost a battle. They had lost the picture of the world they thought they understood. And Norfolk Naval Base, the mighty booming heart of America, was only the beginning. For a long moment the men remained rooted to the deck, staring at the industrial skyline rising before them like some impossible dream. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the line began to move. Guards signaled them forward, ropes tightened, gangways clanged into place. The Liberty ship shuddered as if exhaling, and the German prisoners, still shaken by what they had seen, were shepherded toward the gangplank. What awaited them below would fracture their world view even further. When the first boots touched the wooden boards of the pier, the prisoners expected rifles thrust into their ribs, dogs snapping at their heels, angry shouts driving them like cattle. Instead, the first thing that stunned them wasn't soldiers, or guns, or barking orders. It was smell. Warm, drifting, almost unreal. Fresh bread, roasting meat, coffee, hot, rich, unmistakable. The scent rolled across the docks in gentle waves, weaving around the cranes and crates and workers, slipping into the prisoners' lungs like a forgotten memory. Several men froze mid-step. One reached for the railing as if the aroma alone had made him dizzy. Another blinked rapidly, unable to reconcile the scent of abundance with the starvation he knew awaited his family back home. Unteroffizier Hans Neumann whispered, almost afraid to hear his own voice. Is that meat? Real meat? Behind him, a gaunt soldier murmured, Bread. Is that bread? Their disbelief only deepened when they took in the scene around them. The dock bustled with activity, but not chaos. Everything moved with an orderly hum, workers unloading crates in smooth rhythm, forklifts whirring, sailors shouting directions that sounded more like teamwork than hostility. There was no panic, no desperation, no shortages. America moved like a machine built from confidence. American MPs walked among the POWs, calm, casual, rifles slung but not raised. They nudged the line forward with 2 fingers, not the barrel of a gun. Their uniforms were clean, their boots polished to a shine that caught the morning sun, their faces neither cruel nor suspicious. They looked like men used to discipline, used to order, used to abundance. One of them, a tall Texan with sand-colored hair beneath his helmet, chewed gum as though war were a distant rumor. He glanced at the column of prisoners, tilted his head, and said in a slow, warm drawl, "Welcome to America, boys. Keep the line moving." As if welcome were a normal word to use for men who had been shooting at his countrymen only months before. That casual friendliness hit harder than any weapon. Hans Neumann stopped walking for a moment, staring at the MP as though he'd spoken an incantation. His voice cracked. "They greet us? We invaded half the world. And they greet us?" The German behind him gave a helpless laugh, a laugh born not from humor, but from disbelief so deep it bordered on terror. They moved on, but their minds did not. As the line advanced down the dock, the sensory overload only intensified. Electric cables buzzed overhead, lights flickering even in daylight. Trucks rumbled past, massive, fuel-rich, their engines smooth and steady. Workers lifted crates marked Chicago wheat and Kansas. Beef. Labels that to the Germans looked like symbols of a country bursting with food. Most striking were the men themselves. Dock workers, both black and white, ate sandwiches packed with thick slabs of ham and cheese as they lifted cargo. They passed around metal flasks of steaming coffee. They wiped sweat with clean towels and laughed loud, easy laughter. Their movements had weight, not just physical strength but the confidence of people who knew they were on the winning side of history. A prisoner whispered, "They eat while working with meat during wartime?" Another responded, voice thin with realization. If this is their wartime hunger, then what must their peace be like? The line reached the paved road beyond the pier. Many Germans stopped short. Pavement. Smooth, unbroken, stretching toward a network of roads lined with telephone poles humming with electricity. They had seen paved roads in Germany, yes, but rationed roads, cracked roads, bombed roads. These American roads looked new, untouched, limitless. Trucks rolled by stacked with crates of produce, apples, potatoes, canned goods, so casually that the prisoners felt a twist in their stomachs. Back home, entire towns were hungry. Here, mountains of food traveled as if it were nothing more than firewood. Hans swallowed hard. This is not the America they told us about. A guard heard the whisper and smirked, not mockingly, but knowingly, as if he had heard the same sentence 100 times before. "Keep going," he said gently. "You'll see more." And indeed, they did. As they marched toward the processing buildings, they passed rows of warehouses glowing under vast floodlights, casting long shadows across the endless supplies stacked within. In one doorway, a group of sailors drank coffee from tin mugs, steam drifting into the air. Their uniforms were neat, their cheeks were full, their eyes were bright. One POW muttered, voice breaking, "Look at them. They are not starving, not even tired." Another murmured, "They have electricity everywhere, even outside, even in the morning." With every new detail, the propaganda they had been fed cracked further. America wasn't collapsing. America wasn't starving. America wasn't weak. It was something else entirely, something terrifying in its strength, something awe-inspiring in its abundance, something too vast, too orderly, too confident to be dismissed, a country too powerful to hate. The Germans walked on in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their chests tight, as if every step forced them deeper into a truth they were not prepared to face. And as the gates of the processing center loomed ahead, one final thought settled over them like a heavy, undeniable weight. If this was just the dockyard, what would the rest of America be like? The march from the docks to the intake compound felt less like a transfer and more like a slow descent into disbelief. Every step carried the prisoners deeper into a world that contradicted everything they had been told. But disbelief, no matter how overwhelming, does not erase fear. As they approached the wide windowed building marked receiving and processing, a chill rippled down the line, not from the winter air, but from the collective instinct that whatever humanity they had glimpsed outside might vanish once the doors shut behind them. They braced for the mask to drop. They expected American efficiency to turn sharp, cruel, mechanical. Instead, when the heavy doors swung open and the column stepped inside, what greeted them was not brutality, but order. Real order. Inside the processing facility, order replaced chaos. The room buzzed with structured activity. Long tables lined with medical instruments, Red Cross clerks sitting behind typewriters, interpreters wearing armbands labeled German, nurses in pressed uniforms directing prisoners toward different stations. The air was warm, not suffocating but solid and comforting, a stark contrast to the icy docks outside. A murmur swept through the German column, soft as a shiver. "What is this? It looks like a clinic. No army treats prisoners like this." If the docks had shaken their certainty, this interior shattered the edges. At the first station, an American medic, broad-shouldered, sleeves rolled, glasses slipping down his nose, gestured for the next man to step forward. Prisoner Miller moved with visible dread. His last medical inspection in Germany had been a barked command and a steel rod thrust at his ribs. He flinched as the medic reached toward his face, but the medic did not strike him. Instead, he gently lifted Miller's chin and said, in slow, careful English, "You'll be fine. We take care of wounds here." The prisoner froze. The words hung in the air like a sound he'd forgotten existed. Not simply English, kind English, patient English, human English. It had been years since anyone in any uniform had spoken to him with softness. The medic scanned his chart, nodded sympathetically, and added, "You're dehydrated. We'll get you water soon. Hold still." Miller's eyes glistened. He whispered, barely audible, "Danke." The medic didn't understand the word, but the tone said enough. He gave a brief, warm smile. At the next table, an interpreter asked each prisoner his name, hometown, occupation. His German was accented but clear. "Schmidt, aus Köln," he confirmed, typing steadily. Schmidt stared as the typewriter clacked, astonished that an American clerk was documenting his name with more care than his own officers had shown him during deployment. Another prisoner muttered under his breath, "They treat prisoners like people. But fear is stubborn, and suspicion clings hardest to men who have survived too much." So even as kindness trickled through the room, the Germans scanned every corner for hidden cruelty. They found none. Vaccination lines moved briskly, nurses checking shoulders for infections, offering cotton swabs and murmuring reassurances. One nurse noticed a prisoner trembling uncontrollably and guided him to a chair, giving him time to breathe before approaching with the syringe. "You're all right," she said in clear, simple English. "Just nerves." The man blinked rapidly, baffled. No nurse in Berlin would have paused for nerves. Across the hall, blankets were handed out, thick, warm, soft to the touch. Real blankets, not the threadbare rags they had grown used to in transit. On one table sat stacks of clean uniforms, denim trousers, shirts, jackets. They smelled faintly of soap. Nothing smelled of fear. At another station, a doctor inspected frostbitten fingers. "Too cold on the crossing?" he asked lightly, wrapping them with gauze. The prisoner nodded, unable to find words. His memories of German field medics were filled with shouts, slaps, and commands to keep moving. Here, someone was taking time to look at his hands. "What kind of enemy is this?" he whispered to himself. Suspicion flickered again when a guard stepped forward, but instead of shoving or shouting, the guard extended a cup of water. "Drink slowly," he said. The prisoner took it hesitantly, sniffed it, just in case, but the guard's expression was unflinching, almost concerned. Eventually, the man brought the cup to his lips and drank. Cold, clean water flooded his throat and he nearly choked on the shock of it. Another guard passed out apples. Apples. Fresh, shiny, unblemished. A few prisoners recoiled, thinking it a trick of humiliation. But the guard only shrugged as if saying, "Suit yourself," and moved on. One young POW, barely 18, clutched the apple to his chest like a stolen treasure before finally taking a tiny, cautious bite. His eyes fluttered shut as the sweet juice hit his tongue. He hadn't tasted a fresh apple since 1941. Still, fear lingered, instinctive, ingrained. This could not be real. This had to be a prelude to something harsher. Men looked around for traps, for hidden weapons, for a sudden shift in tone. After all, they had been promised cruelty. They had been promised brutality. They had been promised the worst. But none of it came. Instead came a moment that broke the last defenses. A Red Cross volunteer approached a visibly distressed prisoner who stood alone at the edge of the room, hands trembling violently. The volunteer, a middle-aged man with soft eyes, switched to careful, deliberate German. "Are you cold? Do you need to sit?" The prisoner stared, lips parted. The words were so gentle, so direct, that they sliced through every wall he had built. I don't understand," he whispered. The volunteer placed a hand on his shoulder. Light, reassuring, nothing more. "You're safe now." Safe. The word detonated inside the prisoner like a shell burst. Safe. He hadn't felt safe since before Stalingrad, before Tunisia, before the long winter marches that had stolen so many of his friends. Safe had become an extinct idea. His breathing hitched, his knees softened, and in that moment he realized with a mixture of relief and terror, that the Americans were not playing a trick. They were simply being human. And that truth, more than any rifle or uniform or rule, left the German prisoners more shaken than ever before. The men had barely finished processing, still clutching their blankets, still reeling from the strange gentleness of the medical staff, when the next order came down the hallway. "Mealtime! Move to the mess hall!" The command echoed off the walls, sharp and booming. Instantly, old instincts surged. Backs straightened, shoulders tensed, eyes darted. In German camps, such a bark meant humiliation, punishment, or tasteless rations hurled like scraps to animals. Even in the Africa Corps, food had become a memory more than a certainty. Bread was stale, soup thin, meat a rumor. As they shuffled toward the double doors at the end of the corridor, a cold dread pooled in their stomachs. Processing was one thing, paperwork and needles. But meals were where cruelty showed itself. Hans Neumann leaned toward a fellow prisoner and whispered, "This is where the mask will fall." The other man nodded. "It cannot stay kind. Not this long." The line slowed, and they found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder before the mess hall entrance. Warm air drifted through the cracks under the doors, carrying smells that made every German stiffen in disbelief. Rich, savory, warm. The scent of real cooking. It couldn't be. A few men inhaled sharply as if the air were a trick to lure them inside. Others clenched their jaws, refusing to show hunger. One soldier muttered, "They're fattening us for something. They must be." Yet, for all their muttering, their bodies betrayed them. Stomachs growled, eyes widened. The scent grew stronger. Roasting meat, simmering vegetables, bread pulled fresh from ovens. A guard pushed the doors open. Light spilled out, golden and warm. The lunch bell rang. It chimed with perfect clarity, almost cheerful, as if announcing school recess rather than the feeding of enemy soldiers. The Germans hesitated, then stepped through the doorway, and froze. The mess hall stretched out like a dream. Long tables polished to a sheen, windows letting in cold winter sunlight. American cooks behind the counter moving with methodical ease, counters stocked with metal trays, cutlery, pitchers of milk. Prisoners entered the mess hall expecting watery soup or rotten bread. Instead, trays of roast beef, mashed potatoes glistening with melted butter, vegetable stew steaming with carrots and cabbage, warm bread with crisp crusts. Cold, fresh milk poured into metal cups. For a moment, the room fell utterly silent. Every prisoner stared, wide-eyed, at the food, not daring to touch, terrified the vision would vanish. One man squeezed his eyes shut, opened them again, half expecting the trays to transform into moldy crusts or filthy broth. But the food remained. The abundance remained. The warmth remained. Hans whispered, voice cracking, This cannot be for us." But it was. Slowly, mechanically, the line began to move. Cooks placed portions onto trays, large portions, generous portions, without hesitation, without disdain. Beef sliced thick, potatoes spooned high, bread warm enough to make fingers twitch in longing, As each tray was handed over, the Germans trembled from hunger, from fear, from the unbearable sensation of kindness where none was expected. A young prisoner from Hamburg, no more than 20, thin as a scarecrow, reached the head of the line. His face was pale, his lips cracked. His hands shook so hard the cook had to steady the tray before sliding it toward him. "Eat up, son," the cook said with a friendly nod. The boy swallowed hard. His throat tightened. He stepped away, joining the flow of the prisoners moving toward tables. But as soon as he set his tray down, as soon as he saw the food up close, the steam rising, the butter melting, the bread soft beneath his fingers, something inside him shattered. His tin fork clattered against the tray. He began to shake violently, shoulders heaving, breath hitching, and then, in front of everyone, his legs buckled. He collapsed onto his knees, sobbing, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the world were spinning away from him. "Why?" he cried, voice cracking into raw desperation. "Why? Why would they feed us like this?" The mess hall froze. Chairs stilled. Forks went silent. Breathing halted. Even the American guard stiffened, unsure whether this was an outburst or a breakdown. But the cook, broad-shouldered, red-cheeked, apron stained with grease, stepped out from behind the counter without hesitation. He crouched beside the German boy, one hand braced on his knee, the other gentle on the prisoner's shoulder. His voice was low, steady, carrying a warmth that cut through the stunned silence. "Because you're human, son, and hungry men deserve food." The words seemed to ripple outward through the hall, striking every man like a blow. Not a physical one, a deeper one. A blow to the heart, to the soul, to the lies they'd been fed, to the doctrines they'd swallowed, to the fear that had hardened inside them for years. The prisoner's sobs softened, but tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the floor, mixing with dust and melted snow. Human. The cook had called him human. Not enemy, not prisoner, not German. Human. A murmur spread through the hall, soft, trembling, disbelieving. Men stared at their trays with newfound reverence. Others bowed their heads, overwhelmed. A few raised hands to their faces, wiping away tears that came unbidden. Hans Neumann sat, rigidly at the nearest table, his pulse pounding in his ears. That single sentence echoed again and again, refusing to leave him. Because you're human. He had heard many things in the war. Orders barked, screams silenced, propaganda shouted from podiums. But he had never heard an enemy say those words. Around him, Americans moved calmly, almost sympathetically. A guard fetched a cup of water for the young Hamburg prisoner. Another steadied a man who looked on the verge of fainting. A third simply stood nearby, hands at ease, offering space rather than intimidation. In that moment, an unspoken truth settled over the room like a quiet, devastating revelation. Their captors were treating them with more dignity than the Reich had shown its own men in years. The boy's sobs eased. The cook patted his shoulder once, firmly, and rose to return to his station. Chairs scraped gently as the prisoners slowly, shakily, lifted their forks. The food was real. The kindness was real. The welcome was real. And as the first bites were taken, carefully, reverently, many of the Germans realized they were tasting not just food, but the first crack of a world view crumbling under the weight of unexpected humanity. The first meal had broken something open inside them, but what followed in the days afterward did something far deeper. It reshaped them. The mess hall incident spread through the camp like a quiet fire. Men whispered about it in the barracks, around work details, even during roll call. They replayed the cook's words in their heads, in their sleep, in their letters home. Some tried to dismiss the moment as an anomaly. Others insisted it was a test. But none could deny that something fundamental had shifted. And fate, as if determined to erase every last trace of propaganda, continued the assault. Over the next days, the shock deepened. They saw things no German soldier had been prepared to see. Outside the camp fences, guards leaned against trucks during breaks, laughing, teasing one another with good-natured insults. They played cards, shared cigarettes, talked about baseball. Not a single one spoke with the bitterness or venom Germany had promised America possessed. These were not mongrels, not degenerates, not savages. They were simply men, human, familiar, kind. On supervised outings, the prisoners were driven past American towns, neat rows of houses, white porches, front yards dusted with winter frost. Shops stood open. Churches rang bells. People walked the streets with groceries in their arms, chatting as if the world were not on fire an ocean away. Towns untouched by war. Power lines hummed. Trains ran on schedule. Street lamps glowed at night. It felt like stepping into another world. One where bombs had never fallen, where windows still had glass, where chimneys still smoked with the comforting scent of breakfast. At the camp's edge, German prisoners worked on nearby farms under guard supervision. They stood, stunned at the sight of barns overflowing with hay, cattle herds stretching beyond the horizon, fields planted in perfect rows. Farmers waved from their tractors. Wives brought pies to the fence line for the guards. Children chased each other between fence posts, squealing with laughter. Children playing on sidewalks, laughing, living. For men who had watched their own towns crumble, for men who had seen their siblings duck into air raid shelters night after night, the sight was too much to process. One POW whispered to another as they rode in the back of a military truck, "If my mother could see this, she wouldn't believe such a place exists during war." Even more overwhelming were the factories. They passed one in particular, a plant outside the camp perimeter that produced parts for bombers. The smoke poured from its tall chimneys, but not the harsh, acrid smoke of desperation. This was industrious smoke, purposeful smoke. American workers, men and women, marched in and out wearing clean uniforms, lunch pails swinging from their hands. The assembly lines hummed without pause, machines pounding out metal wings, engines, gears, wheels. An American guard gestured proudly toward the building and said, "This plant produces more in a day than Germany makes in a month." It wasn't bragging, it was fact. And the Germans knew it. Letters became their only release valve. Some wrote cautiously, not wanting Allied censors to erase their truths. Others wrote boldly, without restraint. One prisoner wrote to his mother, "We were told America was weak, but it is we who were starving. They feed us as if we were their own sons." Another prisoner, older, a veteran of both Poland and North Africa, confessed in a letter to his wife, "Now I understand why we lost the war, not because they had more guns, but because they had more humanity." The censors blacked out details, places, numbers, military terminology, but they did not touch the sentences about kindness. They let those truths pass through. Day by day, the camp revealed more contradictions. Americans gave prisoners dental care, actual, careful dental care. They provided books, German books. They encouraged the POWs to form orchestras, soccer teams, theater troupes. They allowed them to mail letters home for free. One guard, noticing a young prisoner struggling with English lessons, sat down beside him after shift and helped him translate a paragraph word by word. When the Germans thanked him, he shrugged. "My brother's across the ocean fighting Germans. But you didn't hurt him. You're just trying to get through this war like we are." That kind of nuance, that kind of grace, was unimaginable in the world the Germans came from. But it was normal here. And the normality was the most shocking thing of all. At night, inside the barracks, men lay awake long after lights out. The room smelled of wool blankets and clean uniforms. Not mold, not rot, not fear. In the dimness, voices whispered across bunks, strange confessions, hesitant realizations. What if they are not what we thought? What if we were the ones who were wrong? What if America is not our enemy? Some men rejected the thought outright. Some clung to the Reich's teachings like a lifeline, but others, especially the young, felt truth creeping in like warm air under a door. It was in these quiet, fragile hours that the camp's most repeated phrase was born, a phrase that passed from bunk to bunk, whispered with awe, confusion, and an ache that none could fully articulate. This can't be America. But every day proved otherwise. This was America, a nation powerful enough to wage war, yet confident enough to show mercy. A nation rich enough to feed its own, yet moral enough to feed its captives. A nation at the height of its strength, yet humble enough to treat its enemies like men. And for the German prisoners who had come expecting darkness, cruelty, and despair, that truth did not merely surprise them. It changed them. Forever. The shift inside the prisoners did not happen all at once. It was slow, quiet, like thawing ice. But by the time a week had passed, the Germans no longer looked at America with fear alone. They looked with something far more complicated: awe, confusion, and a reluctant respect that kept growing day after day. The kindness had broken them open. The abundance had humbled them. But what came next transformed them. For as they settled into the rhythms of camp life, as they watched how America fought this war, not only with weapons, but with character, they began to understand something deeper, something almost philosophical. The realization was not spoken aloud at first. It lived in glances, in long silences, in the way prisoners lingered at fences watching American life unfold. And then, slowly, it took shape. The German prisoners who had crossed an ocean believing they were marching into the jaws of savagery now found themselves confronted with a truth far stranger than cruelty. America was a great industrial power, but it was also a great moral power. They had seen the factories, yes. They had seen the endless trains, the roaring trucks, the overflowing farms. They had seen a nation that could outproduce the world 100 times over. Yet what struck them most was not America's might. It was its mercy. A captured enemy expecting to be beaten was instead offered blankets. A starving boy expecting to be mocked was instead fed warm bread. Men who had lost everything were treated, without hesitation, like human beings. Hans Neumann said it best one evening as he leaned against his bunk, staring at the ceiling. They do not treat us with softness. They treat us with dignity. There is a difference. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, but the Germans had never felt less imprisoned. And for the first time since the war began, they allowed themselves to wonder, what kind of nation fights like this? Their answer came not from lectures or propaganda, but from observation, from the rhythms of American life around them. They saw guards head off for double shifts after long nights. They saw young women in factory uniforms boarding buses at dawn, lunch pails in hand, laughing through exhaustion. They saw men return home from farms with mud on their boots and pride in their posture. No one complained. No one hesitated. Everyone contributed. It was a nation stitched together by sacrifice, willing sacrifice. The prisoners began to understand that America's strength came not only from its machines, but from its people, from a generation that believed in something larger than themselves. A generation later called the Greatest Generation. Farmers rationed willingly, sending their crops across the ocean to feed armies and civilians alike. Women built bombers, riveted steel, welded ships in yards that never slept. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and newspapers for the war effort. Families saved cooking grease, patched clothes, planted victory gardens. And through it all, the nation never lost its humanity. One guard, overhearing a POW marvel at the size of American food rations, simply said, "Well, if we can't feed our prisoners, then what on earth are we fighting for?" That sentence struck the Germans harder than any weapon. One evening, as the sun painted the Texas sky in streaks of orange and gold, a narrator-like voice seemed to settle over the barracks. A truth the men felt in their bones before anyone spoke it aloud. They won not by hatred, but by humanity. That was the secret. That was the weapon Germany had never possessed. As the days passed, the German prisoners began comparing what they saw in America with what they remembered from home. And the comparison was devastating. America in the 1940s was united, brutally focused, morally steady. Neighbors helped neighbors. Communities held together. Everyone, regardless of race, wealth, or birthplace, was asked to sacrifice something for the country. Germany, in contrast, was a landscape of ruins, hunger, suspicion, and fear. But the comparison did not stop there. Even the prisoners sensed it, an invisible line stretching from 1940s America to the America they imagined existed decades later. They saw the unity, the shared purpose, the collective strength that defined this country during the war. And they felt intuitively that such unity was rare, even fragile. Had modern America, whatever it would become, kept all of this, or had it drifted from the moral power that once fed its enemies? The question lingered in the silence. It lingered in the night air. It lingered in the prisoners' letters, though they never wrote it outright. And perhaps it is the narrator's voice, soft, reflective, almost prayer-like, that answers what the prisoners could not. Stories like this remind us who we once were, and who we can still become. The Germans didn't know American politics. They didn't know future headlines, future divisions, future generations. But they did know this. In 1943 and 1944, the United States of America was at the height of its strength, not only because it produced more than any other nation, not only because it fed more than POWs with their peaceful streets and tidy porches. This time, they saw it all with different eyes. Children waved as the trucks rolled by. Farmers tipped their hats. Women carrying groceries paused to smile. No hatred, no vengeance, no celebrations of humiliation, just farewell. One prisoner, pressed against the wooden slats of the truck bed, whispered, "How can a nation fight so hard and hate so little?" The man beside him answered quietly, "That is why they won." As they traveled north toward the eastern seaboard, the landscape changed again. Fields given way to forests, forests given way to factory towns given way to ports bustling with ships and cranes. The same symbols of American power they had first seen in 1943 now returned in full force. Except now, they didn't inspire fear. They inspired respect. One POW, a former engineer from Stuttgart, stared at the endless activity of the docks and said, "They build like giants, but they treat like men." The POWs were loaded aboard a transport ship, another Liberty ship, but this time bright with fresh paint and humming with peacetime calm. The guards lined the pier, not with rifles aimed, but with hands raised in simple farewell. The ship eased away from the dock. The water churned. The distance grew. And then something unexpected happened. German prisoners, dozens at first, then hundreds, lined the railings as America slipped slowly out of view. They watched in silence as the shoreline receded, as cranes blurred into gray silhouettes, as the final line of land thinned into a distant, wavering horizon. For many, the weight in their chest felt heavier than it had when they fled their ruined homes. Hans Neumann placed a hand on the cold railing and whispered, "I came as a prisoner. I leave as a witness." A witness to kindness, to strength without cruelty, to compassion without weakness, to a version of America that felt almost mythical. Behind him, other voices murmured similar sentiments. "I will tell them. I will not let them forget. My children will know the truth." It was not loyalty, it was gratitude. Gratitude that a nation capable of crushing them had instead chosen to lift them. When the ship docked in Europe, the prisoners stepped into a different world altogether. Everything smelled of smoke, rubble, and hunger. Cities lay broken, families scattered, streets cracked, homes flattened. Some were greeted by wives who had grown thin with worry. Some were greeted by silence. No family left, some had no home to return to at all. Amid the devastation, their memories of America became sharper, brighter, almost painfully vivid. One man told his sister, standing beside the ruins of their childhood home, "They fed us every day, even when we were their enemies." Another told a neighbor, "They treated me better than the Reich ever did." Mothers wept, wives stared, old men shook their heads in disbelief. No one had expected stories like these. The greatest surprise of all was what happened next. How those stories spread. From village to village, from family to family, from Germany to Austria to Italy. Tales of American mercy traveled faster than any political message, and they helped rebuild something even harder to restore than buildings. They helped rebuild trust. Years passed. The world moved on. But the memories endured. German veterans who had once feared America now sent letters of thanks across the ocean. Some returned to visit the camps where they had been held, walking the grounds not as prisoners but as free men seeking closure. Some even emigrated to America years later, drawn by the very qualities that had astonished them in captivity. They became factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers, husbands, fathers. Their children grew up reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Their grandchildren fought under the American flag in later wars. And through it all, one truth remained. The kindness the POWs received had become a seed, a quiet, any other nation, but because it cared more than any other nation. Men who had been taught to hate America now found themselves whispering confessions in the dark. I think we were wrong. And as they drifted to sleep under warm blankets, their stomachs full for the first time in years, they felt something they had not felt since childhood. Not safety, not hope, something even rarer. Respect for their captors, for their enemy, for a nation whose kindness, not its firepower, had undone them. And in that respect, quiet, unexpected, deeply human, lay the beginning of transformation. The German prisoners did not realize it at first, but something profound had settled into them by the time the winter turned to spring in 1945. The fear that once clung to their every thought had faded. The suspicion that once shadowed every American gesture had dissolved, and the gratitude, slow, quiet, reluctant at first, had grown into something deep, steady, and abiding. They no longer lived as men who expected cruelty. They lived as men who had witnessed humanity. And that alone changed everything. By the summer of 1946, the war was long over. The Nuremberg trials had begun. Cities in Germany lay broken, hungry, exhausted. And now, after years inside the calm order of American camps, the POWs received new orders. Prepare to return home. The announcement struck the men with a force they didn't expect. They should have celebrated freedom, home, Europe, the chance to rebuild their lives. But instead, a strange heaviness fell over the barracks, a silence thick enough to press on the lungs. Some sat on their bunks staring at the floor. Some folded and refolded their uniforms. Others simply walked the perimeter fence one last time, hands brushing the wire that had confined them, yet also sheltered them. Heinz Neumann leaned against a post and murmured, "I should be happy, but I am afraid." Not afraid of punishment, not afraid of Germany, but afraid of leaving a place where dignity had become normal. The America they had seen was not the monster of propaganda. It was something gentler, something steadier, something worth admiring. And now they had to say goodbye to it. On their last morning at Camp Hearn, the prisoners lined up in the yard as the American flag rippled gently overhead. The air smelled of dust, fresh-cut grass, and breakfast drifting from the mess hall. Eggs and bacon they would not eat today, because today they would be traveling. A guard named Thompson, who had taught several POWs how to swing a baseball bat, stepped forward awkwardly. "Well, you boys take care of yourselves back. Home," he said. "War's over now." He held out his hand. Hans stared at it for a moment, hesitating, disbelieving, then grasped it firmly. "Thank you. Han said softly, for everything. Other guards followed. There were handshakes, claps on the shoulder, a few lingering smiles, even a couple of awkward hugs. One guard handed a prisoner a small wrapped parcel, bread, fruit, and a bar of American chocolate. "You'll need this more than we will," he said. The prisoner's eyes burned. He whispered, "I will tell my sons about you." And then the trucks rolled in. The gates opened. The engines rumbled, and in a slow, quiet procession, the German prisoners boarded for the long journey east. No one cheered. No one jeered. Even the guards fell silent. For months they had lived side by side, not as friends, not exactly, but as men who had learned the shape of each other's humanity. And parting, even between former enemies, felt strangely like loss. The convoy moved across Texas, passing the same small towns that had once astonished the POW seed of gratitude that sprouted across generations. Even today, descendants of those prisoners leave comments, write emails, visit historical sites, saying, "If not for America, my grandfather would have died. I never knew the enemy could show such mercy. My family's story exists because of your country." The legacy of that kindness did not fade. It did not weaken. It grew, stronger with each retelling, clearer with each decade, more precious as the world grew more complicated. And so the story closes not on a battlefield, not in a camp, not with the roar of guns or the signing of treaties, but with the quiet truth spoken by those who lived it. They thought America was weak, but the truth was simple. America was strong enough to be kind. Kindness, the rarest strength, the quietest courage, the most enduring victory. And, in the end, compassion proved to be the most powerful weapon of all. Because wars end, empires fall, nations rise and fracture and rise again, but the memory of mercy, that lives forever.